Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about Samuel de Champlain. But before we do, of course, we need to review a little bit. So let's talk about why kings and queens in Europe were interested in paying money for these men to sail. What were they looking for? Well, there's several ways you can answer that. You could say they were looking for gold. They were looking for a shorter route to the East Indies or Asia. They were looking for a quicker way to get there, to get the spices and things like that. Any of those would be fine. What was the name of the route that Henry Hudson and John Cabot were looking for specifically? And theirs was the Northwest Passage. Northwest because they were heading not only west but north, remember, to try to get around the shorter part of the globe to get to Asia. Remember, Christopher Columbus was going the long way across the middle, and Cabot and Hudson thought they could cut it down shorter by going north. Henry Hudson thought he could go even shorter by going through the North Pole. Let me see if I can make that a little bigger for you guys. There we go. Remember, John Cabot didn't have any interaction with the Native Americans, but Henry Hudson did, and Henry Hudson's seemed to have done well with the Native Americans. What happened to Henry Hudson, remember, we don't really know. His men mutinied and left him and his son and some others in a boat and returned to England. So today we're going to talk about Samuel de Champlain, where he traveled, who he encountered, his discoveries, and things like that. So, the French explorer Samuel de Champlain made his first voyages to North America around the same time Henry Hudson was trying to find the Northwest Passage. Champlain earned a reputation for being a talented navigator by leading a 2-year expedition to the West Indies in Central America. The son of a sea captain, he was not born into high social status in France, but his accomplishments as a navigator and talented mapmaker earned him an honorary title of Royal Geographer from King Henry IV in his court. In 1603, Champlain was invited to sail in a French fur trading expedition to an area known as, at the time, as New France, which was in present-day Canada. Decades before Champlain's expeditions, in 1534, a French navigator and explorer, Jacques Cartier, claimed the shores of the St. Lawrence River, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the areas now known as Newfoundland and Nova Scotia in honor of France. Cartier's attempts to colonize an area around present-day Quebec failed at that time, but these explorations were only the beginning of a fur trading relationship between France and the natives in this area of New France. The goal of Champlain's 1603 expedition was to trade with the native people in the area of New France and return home with beaver pelts and other furs that could be sold in France. During this voyage, Champlain talked to fur traders and fishermen and met native people of the areas he visited. He made a map of the St. Lawrence River, which is a long river that flows away from the Great Lakes and empties into the Atlantic Ocean. When he returned home to France, Champlain published a report on this expedition. By 1604, Champlain took part in an attempt to start a French colony in New France with a small group of colonists. They suffered through a difficult winter in their original settlement near the mouth of the St. Croix River, during which almost half of the colonists died. After Champlain and a few men scouted the surrounding area, the surviving colonists moved to the area presently known as Nova Scotia. This colonization attempt was not a success, but Champlain took the time to explore and map areas along the Atlantic coast, eventually sailing as far south as Cape Cod, which is in the United States, guys. After exploring several possible locations along the northeastern Atlantic coast, Champlain decided that the best place for a French colony would be along the St. Lawrence River. Champlain envisioned or pictured this colony becoming a control center for the fur trade. This was a sign of an important change in the way Europeans thought about North America. John Cabot and Henry Hudson had been trying to find a way to go around America or through it. They were not especially interested in America and its resources. They were interested in goods from Asia and the East Indies, like spices and silk. They thought of America as something that was blocking their way. But with Champlain, he was interested in still finding the Northwest Passage, and he went on several expeditions where that was the goal. But he and many of the men who came with him began to think of North America not as an obstacle, but as a place that was profitable in its own right, and a place that might even be worth settling. In 1608, Champlain received permission to lead an expedition of 3 ships and about 32 colonists from France. He sailed up the river and established a settlement which was named Quebec City. Only 9 of the original colonists, including Champlain, survived the first cold winter in Quebec City, but more settlers arrived the following June. At first, Quebec City was little more than a fort, but Champlain, sorry guys, I'm being distracted by my dogs, had a dream, and he hoped that Quebec City would be a capital of a large and prosperous French colony. He spent the rest of his life working to make that dream a reality. Champlain set up a fur trading station in Quebec City. Native Americans would bring animal furs to Quebec City, and French traders would buy their furs and then ship them back to France. If you can see my dogs here sneaking in there, the other dog's under the table. Sorry. I usually have them outside when I'm doing this. In order to make sure the settlers at Quebec City would not be attacked by the local native people, Champlain made an alliance with some of the tribes who lived along the St. Lawrence, including the Huron and the Algonquin people. He supported these tribes in a war against the Iroquois, a large confederacy of tribes that lived in the South, which is now the New York State. Remember, we talked about the Iroquois Confederacy during our Native American unit. Champlain led expeditions against the Iroquois. During the first of these expeditions in 1609, he became the first European to visit the lake that is now named for him, Lake Champlain. In 1615, he became the first known European to arrive at the Great Lakes. There were more than just a military alliance between Champlain and the tribes, however. They learned things from each other as well. Even the name of the new city, Quebec, was borrowed from the Algonquin language spoken by many Native Americans throughout North America. The word Quebec comes from the Algonquin word meaning Quebec, which means where the river narrows. Champlain made several trips to France to recruit new settlers and secure French government support of his colony. He eventually married and brought his new wife to settle with him in Quebec City. He also brought missionaries to New France to teach the native people about Christianity. The missionaries worked for the fur traders and the settlers to extend French settlements farther inland. In the end, Champlain was successful. The colony of Quebec did not just survive, it prospered. It became the first permanent French settlement on the continent of North America. Remember, we talked about St. Augustine as being the longest continuously inhabited settlement, but Quebec is the first permanent French settlement. The area that made up New France remained part of the French Empire for more than 100 years, and in time became part of a larger country now known as Canada. Over the last couple of weeks, we've learned about many European explorers and their expeditions. You've learned that they were all so intrigued by stories of wealth, spices, and gold that they decided to explore unfamiliar lands and seas. These explorers embarked on investigative travels to find answers to their questions. Now it's our turn to ask a question. Who was the first known European to discover America? As you've heard, Christopher Columbus is the European often credited with discovering the Americas while searching for a route to the East Indies. An area he bumped into was in the Caribbean, which is now known as the West Indies. However, we learned earlier that Viking explorer Leif Erikson, another European, had also traveled to the Americas. Leif Erikson landed in Vinland, which is in present-day Canada and is now called Newfoundland. Historians believe that the Vikings landed in North America about 500 years before Christopher Columbus and John Cabot. John Cabot landed in the same area as the Vikings. Though Newfoundland was not continuously inhabited, it had certainly been by the time Columbus landed in the Caribbean. All the explorers we've learned about, Columbus, Ponce de Leon, De Soto, Coronado, Cabot, Hudson, and Champlain, landed in many different parts of the Americas, claiming their discoveries in honor of their countries. But it's important to remember that these explorers made landfall. They learned that there was already a group of people living in North America. And who were they? The Native Americans. These people had already been in America for many, many years. Though archaeologists debate exactly when and how they arrived, most agree they came from Asia between 15,000 and 50,000 years ago. There is strong evidence that suggests there were about 20 million native people in North America when the European explorers first arrived. Sorry. That means that for every one of Christopher Columbus's men who scouted North America, there were already 10,000 Native Americans living there. The native people lived according to their own customs and cultures. They planted corn and squash and built great civilizations in the Americas. Europeans exploring and later settling in Americas brought their own cultures and curiosity as well as germs and diseases. The Europeans brought changes to the native people's way of life. Although we cannot know for sure who were the first people living in the Americas or when and how they came, we can say for sure that history, culture, and legacy of both the Native Americans and the European explorers are still evident with us today.